Assignment 4.3.3 Quantitative Data Collection. Quantitative data is numerical data which is used to be put into categories and measure what the researcher wants to measure. Within quantitative data, there's 4 techniques that can be used to collect the data. So there's field-based experiments, lab experiments, observations, and questionnaires. The first technique is field-based experiments. Field-based experiments can be defined as experiments that collect data in the environment that stimulates that one which the sport is played. So this means that the researcher will be researching the participant who will be doing an experiment in their own environment, so what they normally train in. So linking to gymnastics, this means that a researcher could be researching running speed for vault in gymnastics, and this experiment will take part in their normal gymnastics hall, so the participant feels comfortable with doing the experiment and it's all the natural environment. The advantages of field-based experiment is that it mimics the performance of the environment. So this means that there is a higher claim of ecological validity because you are collecting your research in a natural setting. Another advantage nerves and doesn't affect how you perform. So a second advantage is it reduces demand, is that the participants are less aware that they are taking part in the experiment, and it also supports ecological validity because it helps with your research and the environment is realistic to what they're being controlled in. The disadvantage of field-based experiments is you can't control all the variables and you have an impact on internal validity. So this means that the results will be less reliable because you can't control everything and some of the variables might change. Also, another disadvantage is the research takes longer because you are conducting it in your natural environment, whereas if you're doing it in a lab, they have all the advanced equipment to be able to do the experiment quickly. Lab-based experiments. So lab-based experiments can be defined as experiments that involves collecting data in an environment where all the conditions and variables are controlled, so they are only measuring the variables in the question. So this means that the experiment will take place in a lab where they'll have top high-end quality equipment, so the results will be more reliable and accurate. Research will get better results for what they want to measure. So the advantages of an example of lab-based experiments in gymnastics, for example, could be that they want to measure the VO2 max of gymnasts because it might help their performance. So they would take the gymnast into a lab, which could be found in an elite performance centre or in a high university where they've got all the high range equipment, and measure the VO2 max of these gymnasts and see how they can improve and what their VO2 max is. So the advantages is high levels of internal validity. All the variables, so you know what you're measuring and the aspects of what you want to measure. The advantage is that it's in a controlled, that the variables are controlled and it's in a controlled environment. This is because that the variables can be looked at specifically because they can be controlled because they know what they're doing and how the equipment is used and how they can manipulate it to get the answers they want and how they can keep the variables the same. And it's in a controlled environment because they're in a lab where everything they do is controlled. Another advantage is that there's a lot of technical equipment, so this increases your precision because and your accuracy, because the equipment's high advanced and means you can get better and more reliable results. Another advantage is when you record this lab-based experiments, you get graphs, and these graphs give clear and precise results. Also, there's a high level of detail of the qualitative data that is produced, so that means that the results are more precise and accurate, and the statistical test analysis shows that they're more easy to analyze the test and that the quantitative data is more objective. Going back to the controlled variables, this means that it can control whether the IV is causes the DV and the causal effect of why this happens. So also going back to the internal validity, it shows that you're knowing what to control and how to control the IV to be dependent on the DV. The disadvantages of lab-based experiments is there's low ecological validity. This means that nerves and the environment around them, because it's different to what their natural setting is, could affect the results, because they might have want to perform better, but also might find it harder to perform in these environments. Because it's less of a real environment to them. So there's also links to not performing in their natural environment, because a gymnast won't be performing in a lab every day or very rarely. There's also demand characteristics, so this reduces the validity, as the participant might work at a level where they're focusing on the experiment and not focusing on what they actually have to do, and this could affect the results. Another disadvantage is the cost of the equipment and the cost in general, because it's a lot of money to run this equipment and to be used. However, you do get more reliable and accurate results, and also the cost of the equipment in general. So these VO2 max machines cost lots of money. They're not cheap things that you can just buy. So also you have the access to the equipment, because these equipments are only found like university or elite performance centres. They're not everywhere. There's not one like in your local gym. The another disadvantage is you have to be a skilled researcher to be able to train and conduct the experiments on these high priced and ranged equipment. Okay, another technique is observation. So observation can be defined as the behaviours within the sport that are related that are observed. Observation happens where there is researcher observing the performance of the participants and they record what they see. So, for example, in gymnastics, a researcher might be wanting to research the landings of gymnasts in their jumps, in their floor routines, or their leaps, or their any type of skills that involve the landing. So these researchers will watch their gymnasts perform their routine. They'd have a table where they fill out what they observe. So they could have the skill down the end, for example, a jump full turn, or a split leap, or maybe a front somersault. They could have the successful amount of lands stuck and the unsuccessful. So they could watch this. They might either do these moves a certain amount of times, or watch their routine a certain amount of times, and just use frequency data in the table to tally how many they've successfully landed or unsuccessfully landed, and then they would work out the total percentage of what they have landed and what they haven't landed. So the advantages of observation is that you can video the experiment and watch back later to annotate the results. This is quite good, because otherwise, when you're observing, sometimes you might miss something out. So if you record it, you can go back and see exactly what they've done and put it back in slow-mo if you need to. Another advantage is to value contributions to the performer, which means that the participant knows that they're being recorded and that the values are being recorded. Another advantage is is that the experiment or the test can be more valid as you know what you're observing and the strengths and weaknesses within the observations. You can also compare the results using the mean, range, and average. So you could watch a few gymnast routines that have the same and compare how the gymnast may have landed more successful or unsuccessful landings. The disadvantages is you may miss some of the behaviours, so then you might miss how they act or miss any type of skill or landing that they don't do. So then that means that your uh, your results are not as accurate because you've not got all the possible answers and outcomes that you need. Another disadvantage is you might need several observers. So say you had 5 gymnasts, you'd have to have at least 5 observers, for one for each gymnast, otherwise one researcher couldn't watch all of them and mark them all down. And another disadvantage, you may need training to be able to record these. These observations could also be observer bias, so they could act differently in front of the observer because they know they're being observed, and that there is ecological validity because it's like they could be observed. It feels like being observed in a lab. The final technique within quantitative data collection is questionnaires. So questionnaire could be defined as when you are trying to collect a large amount of data from large groups, the data you want is not collected in. Going back to observation, within observation there is observation reliability and validity. So the reliability is that it's difficult to replicate these experiments and these environments, and there's confounding variables. There's also shows inter-research reliability, and that there should be a good form of coding to be able to observe these gymnasts. The validity is that the participant knows that they're being observed, which can link to low validity, and it's observer bias as well, which can also lead to low validity. So there's ethical issues within observation. So there's privacy, so that means they need consent to be able to observe these gymnasts. So and it's links to confidentiality and consent. So they have to ask for permission to observe these gymnasts, and the use of findings that they can't show anyone these answers or observations without their consent. So back to questionnaires. An example of questionnaires in gymnastics is that the researcher could be wanting to find out the gymnast's anxiety and pressure during competition. So they would ask questions about how their feelings are and how they feel against it. So these questionnaires can have open and closed questions where there could be simple answers, or the questionnaires that are simple to conduct because they're just a set of questions. The less interpersonal influences, so how they feel, and these questionnaires can be anonymous because they can't share the information without consent. The disadvantages is social desirability, so they might want to look good and give the correct answers that they feel that the research wants to know, which can link to it being biased because they're changing their answers. And understanding of terminology, so these gymnasts might not understand that the questions are being asked, so they might have to explain and elaborate on what they need to ask, which could change their answers. So questionnaires are also just gathering numerical information in different quantities. So in disadvantages also people might lie, and the response rate would mean that they could be thinking of what the correct answer would be to answer. And the advantage is cheap and quick because it doesn't take too long.